Hello and welcome back to another tutorial. I'm Michael and today we will be a little bit more creative. So I will introduce you to the widget system and I will also explain how the widget components work and what they do. And I can also recommend a cool tutorial series called HDF is or WTF is from Mathew Wadstein. And he's straight to the point and his explanations are very good, and I will link his channel in the video description below, and if you like him you can also subscribe to him. I think he will be happy about that. Okay, so first off I just created a third person player template. It's just the standard one you have in the Unreal Engine, and I just created a new folder. I created, or rather copied, the third person template and renamed it, and I just created a basic game mode and a basic player controller. So if you don't know how to create these three things, you can check out my other tutorial about game modes, which I also will link below. Okay, so first off we want to create a widget to see and to get into our UI designer. So right click in an empty space, then go on the user interface and then select widget blueprint. We will just call it main widget and we will double click on it. Now when we have the main widget open, we have this blank space here. This rectangular shape is our canvas, and all things behind it is just empty space. So basically always work inside the canvas. I will show you what happens if you don't do that. So I will just drag a common component into the canvas, and when I drag it out, I can't select it anymore. And I can't move it anymore. So it is basically not rendered anymore. So if it happens that your button, or if you have another component, and it gets outside of the canvas, you can always reset the position up here on the right panel and just put in 0 in the position X and Y. So we get it back here. I think you will also notice if I try to put a component directly inside the empty space, it will not let me do that. So always keep your components inside of the canvas. Now the next thing I want to show you is this down here. Down here we have the resolution, at least our widget resolution, and it's right now on 1280 x 720 in terms of resolution. When we want to upscale it and have a scale for our resolutions, we can use something called a DPI scale. And right now ours is on 0.67. When we click on this cogwheel down here, it will open a new window and we will find something called a DPI curve. So when we click on the first one here, the first point, we will notice a number called 480 in the resolution label. When I get to the next point, it's 720 and the last point 1080. Now you might recognize these numbers because they are frequently used in videos like on YouTube. So that means 480p, that means 720p, and that means 1080p, so full HD. When we click on them, they have different scales. So one is the maximum one, so it's a full screen UI, and all things below one have a different scale and will be scaled in terms of the resolution. So the widget looks right in every resolution. So that's what this basically does. If you want to add a new one like 1440p, you can just go into the DPI curve, then hold shift, left shift, and left click on this curve here. Then you can type in resolution 1440, and you can use a scale of 1, and you can scale down the 1080 to something like 0.88 or 0.9, something in between the points here. I think you need to experiment with it so you'll find the right resolution, but that's basically the gist of it. Okay, so I will just delete them and I will close the DPI curve. Now, when we drag in any component, we will have one general option here, like this slot, and you might notice when I have the button selected, we have this flower symbol in the top left. This flower symbol is called an anchor, and the anchor determines where our relative position of our component is. So if I would change the anchor to the middle or change the anchor to the bottom, it will always place our component in relation to the anchor down here. So an anchor is pretty important because it ensures that in every resolution your component will stay at the same position all the time. So for example, if I have a button or any other object and I have it in the middle, it would be much more useful to use an anchor which is in the middle instead of on the top left or in any other position. So, or if you have a slider down here, it is better to use an anchor in the bottom left instead of the bottom top, in the left top or any other position. So that's very important, and if your position is wrong or if your components are on the wrong position, you might want to double check the anchor if the anchor is set right. So we have the next two parameters called position X and position Y, and they're just controls where we have our position. Then we have the size X and size Y, which is just scaling of the component itself. Then we have alignment and Y alignment, it's again just moving. And then we have something called a Z order. And the Z order is a very, very important topic. So I will show you what the Z order does. So I have a button right now in here. I will use an image component and overlap the image component on top of the bottom. And then maybe a progress bar, which I also overlay on top of the button and of the image. Now I have no control over what component should be rendered in the very front and in the very back. To fix that, we can use a Z order. So a higher Z order means it will be prioritized higher. For example, if I want to have the image at the very back, I just need to increase the Z order from this button. So for example, I will take 1 and it will be rendered in front of the image because the image has a Z order of 0 and the button has a Z order of 1. Now this one, the progress bar, also has a Z order of 0. So it is always a good idea that two different widgets which overlap, I mean when two different components which overlap don't share the same Z order. So we give this, because it's at the front, the highest number, which is 2. The next one, which is the image, are the order of 1. And the last one, the progress bar, will have a z order of 0. So this is a very useful option. Now I will delete most of them, and I will just make a quick overview and a quick explanation what each of these most used components do. The first one is the border. You can think of it like a container. You can put in here another widget or a different widget or a different user interface, and you can use it with the main widget itself. So for example, if I right click in the content browser, select user interface and create another widget and say it's a child widget, I open my child widget and put just random components in there, and then compile it and save it and go back to my main widget. Then I can just go on the left panel here, scroll down, go under user created, and then put my child widget inside the border. My child widget will automatically snap to the borders of my border, and I will be able to utilize my child widget inside this border. When I move the border, the child widget will also move, and when I scale the border, I can show more of the widget. I can also change the contents inside the border by going to the content tab and content color and opacity, click on it and change the color of the widget, which is a very useful feature. I can also go to the alpha value and make my widget, which is inside the border, transparent by going below 1. I can have padding. I can also align them to certain points. And I can also change the appearance of the border itself. So if I want to have a background which is not white but black, I can just go down to tint and make it black. So that's basically the color shift option. Then I can specify an image, either a texture or a material. And one important note, if you use a material with a user interface, you need to change the material domain to user interface inside the material editor. That's because materials need to be converted to be able to be used in user interfaces. One important note too, if you want to have a widget or a user interface which needs to glow, you can't use widgets for that. Widgets don't use lighting information and they can't glow or take lighting information. Okay, so under the image we have the image size, which is self-explanatory. We have the tint, what I showed earlier. Then we have the draw as option, where we have basically 4 different options. None, which makes the border basically invisible. Box, which creates a box around the border and uses the image or the material. And you can use margins to space them out or to create spaces between the border. Like it's like padding. And then we have the border option, which will just create a border around the border. And we can create a margin too here. And then we can have a full-sized image. So our image is completely shown and not cut off. When we use the draw as image option, we can also use a tiling option. And tiling just means that when we drag it out or when we make the scale bigger than the texture bounds actually are, the texture itself will repeat. So it's just repeating textures. Okay, so the next thing which we have here is the brush color. nothing really happens here. But that's not very important because it basically does the same thing like the tint. I can actually show you that. I just use a random texture and take the tint out, and then I can change the brush color, and our texture will change colors. That's what it basically does. We can also change the opacity. So we have a transparent border or semi-transparent border. We can have a desired size scale. We then have this one here, the behavior tab, and this regulates if you want to have the border enabled or not. You can also bind it, and a binding, when I click on it, is basically just a function inside a widget. So a function inside a widget is equal to a binding. It's nothing more. Then we can have a tooltip text, and we can also change the visibility. We can change it to collapse, to hidden, and these other two options. And we can also bind it to a function, so we can change it later on. We have a little performance option here. It's not very important. And then we have the render transform. So we can manually translate it into a different direction. We can scale it on both axes. We can shear it, so we get kind of a warp. We can do it like this too. Then we can rotate the widget. And we can change the pivot position, so we have a reference point where these three options will be applied to. So if we have a pivot point up here, it will, the translation and scale and shear and angle will always be translated in relation to the pivot point up here. So it's kind of the centering point of the border. Then down here we have 4 different events. The first one is called on mouse button down. You can also bind it to a function. And the on mouse button down just means when we click on the border, it will execute this event. When we don't click on this event and we release our mouse button, this event will execute. When we move around in the border, the on mouse move event will trigger. And when we double click on the border, the on mouse double click event will trigger. So you actually just use the border for child widgets and other widgets. We will probably use them in part 2. So, and one important thing, when we use a widget inside of a border, we can't just put multiple widgets inside one border. So when I try to do that, it will not let me. If you want to have multiple widgets inside a main widget, you need to have multiple borders in order to do so. Okay, so that's what basically the border is. The next one is the button. And when we drag out the button, we have a lot of options here. We have the same stuff like the anchors and the positional data, like in the border example. And when we go down to appearance, we have here a little expansion menu under style. And a button basically executes something when we press on it. That's its function. And under the normal tab, we can specify an image, and we can also tint it and have also this option like the border option, draw as, and we can also use margins. Now these 4 are called states. So the first one is called the normal state. The normal state will be used when the button is untouched. It's a normal idle appearance of the button. The next one is the hovered one. And the hovered state is being executed when we hover over the button. We get the press state when we press on the button or click on the button, and we get the disabled state when we deactivate the button. Then we have something called normal padding, which will just create spacing on the borders of the button on the idle state or the normal state. And we have pressed padding, which will which is spacing being applied on the pressed state. Then we can have a press sound. So if we want to press our button and we want to play a sound, we can specify it here. And we can also specify a hover sound if we hover over the button. Then when I go through these tabs, all these states have the same options, like the normal one. So we can specify an image or a material or a texture. We can specify the image size. We can specify the color. And we can specify the option to draw it as an invisible button, which still can be clicked and pressed, but it will be invisible visually. We can draw it as a box. We can draw it as a border, and we can draw it as a full-sized image. We can also tile it, and all these different states share the same details. Okay, so down here we have the color and opacity tab, and nothing happens. And that's because the color and opacity is being applied to the contents inside the button. So if I would drag in a text or a slider or an image, anything, and drag it into the box itself, and we go back to the button option and change the color and opacity, we will basically be able to color the contents inside the button. So that's a neat way of changing things around, which are inside the button. Now we can have the background color, and we can change the color from our button itself. So the overall color, like this. Cool. So we can also change the opacity, like for our contents. All things below 1 will be semi-transparent or transparent. And under the background color we can do the same under the alpha channel and make our button semi-transparent and not just the contents inside it. Then we have the tick box or checkbox called as focusable, and that just means that our click events or our mouse button has always priority to key event or over key events. So if you click on it, it will basically ignore key presses, and we will get more. Or if I need to rephrase it, the click events will get will be prioritized in terms of the importance of the key of the input. And yeah, that's basically what its focusable does. It just gives our click events more power instead of our keyframes, key presses. Then down here we have a behavior tab. We can enable and disable our button. We can also bind a function. So we can also use a tooltip text and bind that to a function. And we can also bind our visibility to a function and change the visibility. But it's the same stuff like in the border example. Down here in the tooltip widget, we can specify a widget which can show a tooltip, and we can specify it here. Right now we have child widget and the main widget here, which we could use as some kind of tooltip, but that's just, well, it's toying around with the widget a little bit more. Then we have this little performance option, which is not that important. And then we have the render transform, like in the border example. So we can change the position manually. We can change the scale. We can change the shear or warp it. And we can use the rotation of the button, and we can set a new pivot point. Now, if we go down to the events, you might notice that there is no binding. And that's because buttons are meant to be interacted with, and they are already more accessible than a binding. So under the events, we have the onClicked event, which will basically trigger if we click on the button. The onPressed event will execute when we click or press the button. The onReleased event when we release our pressed button on the button. Then the onHovered event will trigger when we hover over the button, and the unhovered event will trigger when we hover over the button and then go back to an empty space. So that's what basically a button is all about. The next thing is a checkbox. And you will notice similarities to the button. Just when we go to the right panel and have our checkbox enabled, we have something under the Appearance tab called Check State. And the check state has three options: unchecked, checked, and undetermined. So unchecked means, like, I think you have seen this checkbox, and checkboxes are very common in formulas and online formulas and yeah, other things. And you can then interact with it and change the check state to checked, and you can even put it to undetermined, so if you click on it in game, it will be enabled. We can also bind this functionality to a function, so we can update it and change it at runtime. We can also use the horizontal alignment, which doesn't do much, at least not for the checkbox. And then under Appearance we have the Style tab, and under the Style tab we have the checkbox type. We can change the checkbox type to checkbox or toggle button. Now these are two different things, because a checkbox is a normal checkbox and behaves like a normal checkbox, but the toggle button can be used in conjunction with an image which is being displayed, and not just a static piece of a checkbox. Then we have a unchecked image option, an unchecked hovered image option, and an unchecked pressed image option. Basically, it is like the button example. You can specify an image or a material inside the unchecked image tab, and this just refers to the unchecked state. So this state, and will change the unchecked image to the hovered image if you hover over it, or to the pressed image if you click or press on it. But that will just happen if you have the unchecked part of the checked state enabled. So for example, the unchecked image is just the idle color, or the idle image, and the unchecked hovered image for the hovered functionality, and the pressed for the pressed functionality. Now we have here the checked image, the checked hovered image, and the checked pressed image, and we have the undetermined image and the undetermined hovered image and the undetermined pressed image. A lot of words, but these three and these three do basically the same stuff like these three do. They are just being applied to the different check states. Like the checked images for the check state and the undetermined images for the undetermined check state. Then we can have some spacing or padding. Then we can use the foreground color, and you will see it will change the checkbox, at least the color of it. You can also use the opacity again and put it to 0.5 and make it transparent. And then we have an option called border background color. Now if we change something here around, nothing will change, and that's because this option here is being applied to the toggle button. So if you want to use the border background color down here, you can only use it with the toggle button and not with the checkbox button. The checkbox button just uses the foreground color up here. We can also change the alpha opacity or the opacity of the border background color down here. We can also specify a sound which will be played when we have the checkbox checked. We can also have an unchecked sound when the check state is unchecked. And we can use the hovered sound if we hover over the checkbox. Now we have is focusable, which basically just means that our click events are prioritized in order to key events. Then we have our behavior, which we had in the button and the border example. We have the is enabled, we have the tooltip text and the visibility. Then we have our performance tab, and then we have again our render transforms, where we can change these options, like in the button and border example. And down here is a very important event called onCheckStateChanged. And the onCheckStateChanged will always be applied or executed when we change our checkbox from an unchecked state to a checked state, or from an undetermined to a checked state, just basically when we change the check state up here. Then this event down here will happen and execute. So you can tie a little bit of blueprint information or blueprint nodes after the event and do cool stuff with it. That's it for the checkbox. Then we have the image. And the image basically is an image. You can just go up and you can specify an image under the brush section, a texture or a material. You can size the image, you can color the contents inside it, and you have the same options like in the border, checkbox and button examples. Then we have the color and opacity, where we also can change the color, and we can also make it transparent. Then we have the behavior tab, the performance tab, the render transform tab, the navigation tab, and then we have again advanced. The thing is here we only have a binding or a function, and that's because images are normally not used for key presses or for events happening. So that's why there's a bind, and we have on the button actually a real event. Okay, so that was it for the image. Then we have something called a name slot, and it's not difficult to explain, but basically if you have our border here and you use a border, when we drag it in and we want to add a text on our child widget, we can't. And that's because we can't add random stuff from our component, or rather of this component menu, on a different widget. So in order to do so, we can go to the other widget, then just drag in a name slot, compile it, save it, go back to our main widget, and then when we try to put something in it, I think I need to expand it, we can put it under the name slot. So that's very important if you want to add something to a child widget, and you don't want to get into your child widget and want to change things around. It's very handy and very convenient. Then, let's see, name slot, yeah. The next thing we have here is the progress bar. You will probably use that all the time. When you look at hunger bars or HP bars or mana bars in other games, you might well use a progress bar for it. So it will basically just fill this image here. So when I select the progress bar and go to the right panel, we can change some options here. So under style, we have the background image, which is basically the idle image of the background of the progress bar. And we could change it to something like T-brick cuts down. We have the same options like in the other examples. We can also specify margins and such. And in the fill image, we can specify a different texture. So if we want to have our HP bar filled and not empty, we would need a filled HP bar. And I will take the T cobblestone rough N. Now, when I go down to the percentage here, you will notice our texture will be overwritten with the fill image. So that's how it basically works. And you might notice that the percentage only goes from 0 to 1. 0 being minimum and 1 being maximum. You can also bind it to a function, and you can update it in runtime if you want to change the percentage around, which you might want to do. You can change the bar fill type from left to right to left, then to fill from center, then to from top to bottom, and bottom to top. You can also use a marquee image, which is basically this one here. And a marquee image can be used mostly for animated textures and images. And it is mostly used for solid things, so solid buttons and solid fill images. We can also use tiling here, like in the other examples. And when we go down here, we can also change the fill color and opacity. So this basically changes the fill color. We can also bind it again to a function. We can also make it transparent. And when we test it, it looks, yeah, a little bit different. Okay, so if we go down here, this is the usual stuff I already explained. The performance section, the render transform, the navigation, and the progress bar has no events at all. The reason why it has no events is that that it is more of a visual indication instead of an interactable object. So if you have an HP bar, you want to see what happens with your HP bar or your mana bar, but you don't want to interact with it directly. Now, the progress bar doesn't need to use a bar. You can also use a glass, like in Diablo, a mana glass. You just need to specify a texture which is in the idle state, and a fill image or a fill texture when the glass should be full. And the rest will be sorted out with the material or with the texture. So the progress bar is pretty cool, and you will probably use them a lot. Okay, the next one is the slider, which I will drag in. I will make it a little bit wider. We can't interact with the progress bar, but we can interact with the slider. And when we go on the right panel, we can see again a value under appearance, and we can change the handle here from minimum 0 to maximum 1. We can also change the orientation to vertical, so it goes up and down. And we can also bind the value through a function and update the slider at runtime. Now the next thing we have here is the slider bar color. So we can color this bar here. Let's go for a red. We have our normal options here, like again the alpha value where I can make it transparent. And then we can change the slider handle color, this one here, to maybe something like blue. Then we have something called step size. And step size is not very important to people who actually use a mouse. If you use key presses or the keyboard, or controller buttons like X or triangle or rectangle and such, you might want to look into the step size. The step size determines in which intervals you can change the handle. So if you take bigger intervals like 0.01, the intervals will get bigger and the slider will change in bigger increments. So the smaller the number, the smaller the increments it will move when you have a key press or a button of a controller, and the higher it is, the higher the intervals. We can also indent the handle. It basically just indents the handle. And we can lock the interaction from the slider. So you might use that if you have the slider in game and you don't want the player to interact with the slider anymore. You can just at the runtime or in game activate the locked state, and the player will not be able to interact with the slider anymore. Now down here we have a style, and you might recognize these things from the bottom. We have the idle bar image, and we can specify a material and a texture. Then we have the disabled bar image if it is locked. Then we can use the normal thumb image, which is the idle handle image or material. And we can use the disabled thumb image when the handle is locked. Down here we have something called bar thickness, which just scales up the bar. And we have is focusable again, which I already explained. The behavior, the performance, the render transform. And down here we have again events. So these other four are not that important unless you use a controller, a console controller, or you use or you actually want you want to activate the slider when you click on something or interact with the mouse. But these are not that important. The most important topic here, or rather option here, is the onValueChanged event. And the onValueChanged event will always trigger when you take the handle and you move it to a different position. So it will probably update all the time when you use the slider and change the position of the handle. You can change some blueprint things after it, and yeah, this is basically the event you will probably use the most if you use a slider. Okay, so the next component is the text. Well, what it does is actually pretty self-explanatory. It's just a simple text. So you can go up here In the right panel you can specify a text under content like my child widget, and it will just change the text. You can also bind it to a function again, so if you want to change it at runtime or in game, you can update your function and update your text with it. Then we have under appearance the color and opacity, where you can change the color of the text. You can make it transparent under the alpha channel. You can use a different font if you want. You can change the options, how it should be displayed in bold italic or light regular, and the font size is here. Then we can also use something called shadow offset. So if we want to have a shadow behind the text, we can increase the stuff. But if you want to have the shadow enabled, you need to go to shadow color, go down to the alpha value and put in a 1 and change the value to 1. Then your shadow will appear, and you can change the offset if you want to offset the shadow. So that's a pretty cool thing. Then a minimum desired text, and it's how it should be displayed at the minimum size, so it will always remain in a minimum size and be displayed in a minimum size. Justification, well, it's just the alignment of the text. Then we can have a margin, and then we can have a line height percentage, which is basically spacing if you put something below it. Now, one important thing, if you want to change to the next paragraph and you are in the text window here, you can't just press the enter button. Nothing will happen. There is some kind of HTML command, I think break or anything like that, and this will basically take you to the next paragraph. But I don't know the command out of my head, so you might need to look it up. Okay, so when we go down here, we have wrapping. We can auto wrap the text, which I won't recommend. We have the wrapping policy, so how the thing should be wrapped. And then we have the behavior, we have the render transform, and we have localization, which is not enabled and we can't change. We have no events here because the text is also just a visual representation, like our progress bar. Now, the last thing we will use is the text box. And you can actually edit the text box, which you can't with the text, at least not directly with player input. So the text box can be used for player input if you want to write something in it. When we go up, we have a lot of options. We can have a long text here, which will be displayed right at the start, but you can change the text later on. So like this. And when I'm in game, I can edit this one here, this text. I can also bind a hint text when there's no text in the text box. I can also bind the text to an update function. And under style, we can change a lot of things. So this one should be familiar when I explain the button and image and other components. And this basically means background, the background idle image. We can change it to a material or texture and do all this other stuff with it. We can use the background image hovered if we hover over the box. We can change our image to the background image focused if our text box is being edited so it is in focus. And then we can have a background image when we have it set on read only and we can't write into the editable box. Then we have normal padding. We have a font which we can change. We have a foreground color. And we have a background color for the box itself. Then we have also the read-only foreground color. And we have H scroll bar padding and V scroll bar padding. And this is just padding when we scroll horizontally or vertically. So if our box is maybe a little bit big, we can scroll down or to the side. That's basically the padding of it. Then we have the scroll bar style. We can have a horizontal background image. So if we want to have the scroll bar, if we want to have a custom scroll bar image or material, we can choose it here for the horizontal. When we want to have a custom vertical background image for the vertical scroll, we can use it here. When we have a vertical top slot image and a top slot image here and a vertical bottom slot image here, I think you get the gist of it. So you can customize your scroll bars in these options here. Then we have the normal stomp image, which is the thing which blinks, and when you write things, it's this pointer-like line, and you can change the image for it. You can also change it when it's hovered, and you can also use a custom image when you drag it around. Then we have an appearance tab here. Should it be read-only, so we can't write in it? Should it have a password? And we have this minimum desired width, so it's the minimum width we can display our editable box. Then we have our normal behavior, if it is enabled and visible, our performance tab, our render transform, and down here under events we can use these two. On text changed is being triggered when we change the text or edit the text, and on text committed is when we press the enter button or we are done editing the text box. So yeah, I think that was a lot of stuff, and I will see you probably in the next part. We have the child widget explained, or we have the widget system explained, and in the next part we will try to integrate basic and simple widget to blueprint communication. We will also use binding functions and update functions, and we will also create a real-time example, which will probably be a very fun thing. Okay, so I see you in the next part, hopefully, and I see you next time. So, see ya.